At 8:47 p.m. on May 26, 1941, Sub-Lieutenant Percy Jick watched from the deck of the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal as 15 antiquated biplanes took off in a furious storm in the North Atlantic. They were the Fairey Swordfish, planes so slow they looked like they were flying in slow motion, with a maximum speed of only 220 kilometers per hour. German pilots called them gladiators, because only a gladiator would be brave enough to fly that World War I relic. Others called them string bags because their canvas and wood structure looked like it was about to fall apart at any moment. But on that stormy night, these flying toys had an impossible mission: to find and stop the most powerful warship ever built, the Bismarck, which had sunk the pride of the British Royal Navy just 4 days earlier. And they had less than 2 hours before the Bismarck escaped to waters protected by the Luftwaffe. What happened in the next 90 minutes would forever change the course of World War II and prove that sometimes the most unlikely weapon can defeat the most formidable enemy. On February 14, 1939, the Blohm & Voss shipyard in Hamburg launched something the British Navy had feared since the end of World War I, the KMS Bismarck. At 251 meters long and displacing 50,000 tons, it was the largest warship Germany had ever built. Its statistics were frightening. 8 380mm main guns capable of firing 800-kilo shells at a distance of 36 kilometers. 12 150mm secondary guns. Krupp steel armor up to 320mm thick at vital points, practically impenetrable to most Allied shells. But the true terror of the Bismarck was not just in its firepower. The ship was designed with extreme compartmentation, 22 watertight compartments that theoretically made it unsinkable. Its fire control systems were the most advanced in the world, using mechanical computers that calculated distance, wind speed, and target movement in seconds. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, the fleet commander, declared confidently, "The Bismarck is invincible. No Allied ship can face it in direct combat." On May 18, 1941, the Bismarck departed from Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen for Operation Rheinübung Rhine exercise. The mission was simple and devastating: enter the North Atlantic and destroy the supply convoys that kept Great Britain alive. Hitler had personally ordered the Bismarck not to engage British warships, only civilian targets. The strategy was cruel but effective: cut the supply lines and forced the British surrender through starvation. British intelligence detected the Bismarck's departure almost immediately. The Admiralty in London panicked. If the Bismarck reached the open Atlantic, it could sink dozens of merchant ships before any fleet could intercept it. Winston Churchill issued a 3-word order that mobilized the entire Royal Navy: sink the Bismarck. On May 24, 1941, at 5:52 a.m., the Bismarck met its first real challenge: HMS Hood, the largest British battlecruiser, accompanied by the new battleship HMS Prince of Wales. The Hood was the pride of the Royal Navy, 262 meters long and known as the Mighty Hood. For 20 years, it had been the symbol of British naval power. But it had a fatal flaw: its deck armor was thin, vulnerable to plunging fire. The battle began at a distance of 25 kilometers. The Bismarck opened fire first. Its fire control systems worked with lethal precision. In the fifth salvo, at 6 a.m., a 380mm shell from the Bismarck penetrated the Hood's deck and detonated in the main ammunition magazine. The explosion was so violent that it broke the ship in half. The Hood sank in less than 3 minutes. Of the 1,418 men aboard, only 3 survived. The world was in shock. The Royal Navy's unsinkable ship had been destroyed in minutes. The Bismarck continued its route, seemingly invincible. The Prince of Wales, damaged and outmatched, was forced to retreat, deploying smoke screens. The news reached Churchill during an official dinner. Witnesses reported that the Prime Minister turned pale and repeated in a low voice, "The Hood is gone. The Hood is gone." After sinking the Hood, the Bismarck had a critical problem. During the engagement, a shell from the Prince of Wales had punctured a fuel tank in the bow, causing an oil leak and contamination of the fuel system. Admiral Lütjens made a fatal decision: cancel the Atlantic mission and head for the French port of Brest for repairs. But first, he needed to escape the British fleet that was now pursuing him with a thirst for revenge. The Royal Navy mobilized everything it had: 2 aircraft carriers, HMS Ark Royal and HMS Victorious, 3 battleships, HMS King George V, HMS Rodney, and HMS Ramillies, 2 battlecruisers, 13 cruisers, and 21 destroyers. Over 40 ships hunting a single target. For 31 hours, the Bismarck disappeared. The British lost contact. The German ship was using evasive maneuvers, constantly changing course, hidden by the vastness of the North Atlantic. In London, the Admiralty calculated the disaster: if the Bismarck reached the cover of the Luftwaffe on the French coast, it would be practically impossible to attack it. And then it could be repaired in return for another campaign of destruction. On May 26, at 10:30 a.m., an RAF Catalina finally relocated the Bismarck 1,100 kilometers off the French coast. The ship was only 24 hours from safety. The situation was desperate. HMS King George V and HMS Rodney were pursuing, but were too far away and critically low on fuel. If they did not intercept the Bismarck in the next few hours, they would have to abandon the pursuit. There was only one chance: HMS Ark Royal, an aircraft carrier operating near Gibraltar, could launch a torpedo attack. But there were serious problems. First, the weather was horrible: 65 km/h winds, 10-meter waves, torrential rain, and near-zero visibility. Conditions that would normally prevent any air operation. Second, the only planes available were the Fairey Swordfish, obsolete biplanes that flew so slowly they seemed to hover in the air when facing strong winds. Third, aerial torpedoes were notoriously inaccurate. Even in ideal conditions, the hit rate was less than 10%. At 2:50 p.m., 15 Swordfish took off from the Ark Royal amidst the storm. The waves were so high that the carrier deck rose and fell 17 meters every few seconds. 3 planes were nearly thrown into the sea during takeoff. The pilots flew through dense clouds, cutting rain, and violent turbulence. After 40 minutes of flight, they spotted a ship through the mist and launched their torpedoes. 11 torpedoes in the water. Explosions. Direct hits. The pilots returned to the Ark Royal celebrating victory. But then an urgent message arrived from the cruiser HMS Sheffield, under air attack. British torpedoes. Catastrophic error. In the low visibility, the Swordfish had attacked the Sheffield itself, which was tracking the Bismarck. Luckily, most of the torpedoes had detonated prematurely due to faulty magnetic detonators. The Sheffield escaped unscathed, but the disaster revealed a critical problem with the torpedoes. Time was running out. The sun was setting. It was the last chance. At 7:10 p.m., the Swordfish were rearmed with new torpedoes, this time with simple contact detonators, not magnetic ones. 15 planes, 15 crews, against the most powerful warship in the world, in a storm, with night quickly falling. Lieutenant Commander Tim Coode, leader of Squadron 818, gathered his pilots. The mission was suicidal, and they all knew it. The Bismarck had 80 anti-aircraft guns. Its maximum speed was still 28 knots. And now it was completely on alert. But there was no choice. If they failed, the Bismarck would escape. At 8:47 p.m., the Swordfish took off from the Ark Royal for the last time. Sub-Lieutenant Percy Jick, observer in one of the planes, described the scene. The deck was going up and down like a mad elevator. I thought we were going to die on takeoff. The planes were so fragile that the pilots could feel the wood and canvas structure vibrating under the wind. But the Swordfish had an unexpected advantage: they were so slow and flew so low that the Bismarck's sophisticated fire control systems could not adequately track them. At 9:05 p.m., the Swordfish spotted the Bismarck through the mist and rain. The steel giant was making aggressive evasive maneuvers, turning and accelerating to avoid the torpedoes. Immediately, the sky filled with anti-aircraft fire. Tracer bullets cut through the air in all directions. 105mm explosions created walls of deadly fragments. The German gunners fired everything they had. But the Swordfish kept advancing. Sub-Lieutenant John Moffett flew one of the slowest planes in the squadron. He descended to only 18 meters above the raging waves, so low that the spray from the whitecaps hit the wings of his biplane. The Bismarck turned sharply to avoid it, its guns thundering. Moffett held his course. 800 meters away, he released his torpedo. The Mark 12 hit the water and began its 40-knot run toward the target. The other swordfish attacked in sequence, coming from different directions to confuse the German gunners. 13 torpedoes in the water. Cannon explosions. Planes shaking from the turbulence of the anti-aircraft detonations. And then, at 9:15 p.m., the impossible happened. Moffett's torpedo hit the Bismarck in the stern, in the worst possible place, directly on the steering system. The explosion destroyed the rudders and jammed them in a 12-degree position to port. Inside the ship, damage control teams desperately tried to unjam the rudders. Divers were sent down. Explosives were used to try and break the locked mechanism. Nothing worked. The Bismarck began sailing in large circles, unable to control its direction. The most powerful ship in the world was now adrift, circling like a wounded duck. Admiral Lütjens sent a message to German Naval Command, "Ship impossible to maneuver. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." That night, the Bismarck crew knew they were doomed. Without steering control, they could not escape. They could not maneuver. They could only wait for dawn and the British fleet that was now converging on their position. The 15 swordfish returned to the Ark Royal. Miraculously, all survived despite the intense anti-aircraft fire. Several planes were riddled with bullet holes, but the canvas and wood structure had absorbed the impacts without catastrophic failure. One pilot commented, "They call us toys. But what toy can stop the Bismarck?" On the morning of May 27, 1941, at 8:47 a.m., HMS King George V and HMS Rodney found the Bismarck sailing in slow circles at only 10 knots of speed. The wounded giant could not escape, but its main guns still functioned. The final battle began at a distance of 23 kilometers. The Bismarck opened fire first, but its shells missed. Without maneuverability, the ship could not adjust position for proper aiming. The British battleships responded with devastating salvos. 406 mm and 356 mm shells rained down on the Bismarck. But its armor initially held up. The first hits did not penetrate the main armor belt. Then the British changed tactics. Instead of firing at the flanks, they began firing at the upper decks and superstructure. Explosions destroyed the conning towers, fire control systems, and radio antennas. At 9:02 a.m., a salvo from the Rodney hit the Bismarck's command tower. Admiral Lütjens and his entire staff died instantly. The ship was now fighting without central command, with local teams controlling each gun turret independently. At 9:31 a.m., all of the Bismarck's main guns were silenced, destroyed or crewless. The ship was on fire but still floating, its armor tenaciously resisting. By 10 a.m., the British battleships had fired over 2,800 shells at the Bismarck. The ship was a floating furnace. Fires raged on all decks. The superstructure was unrecognizable. But it still would not sink. HMS Dorsetshire, a heavy cruiser, was ordered to finish the job with torpedoes. At 10:36 a.m., it launched 2 torpedoes into the Bismarck's port side. 3 minutes later, it launched one more into the starboard side. At 10:39 a.m., the Bismarck began to list rapidly to port. German sailors jumped by the hundreds into the freezing Atlantic water. The Nazi war flag still flew from the mast. At 10:40 a.m., the KMS Bismarck completely capsized and sank stern first, disappearing into the dark waters of the North Atlantic. Of the 2,200 men aboard, only 114 were rescued. Over 2,000 German sailors died in the sinking or in the freezing water. The Dorsetshire and other British ships were rescuing survivors when a U-boat alert forced the fleet to abandon the area, leaving hundreds of men to die of hypothermia. The commander of the Dorsetshire wrote in his report, "I have never seen men die with such dignity." They sang the German national anthem as the ship went down. The Bismarck, the ship Germany believed to be invincible, was sunk not by modern battleships or advanced technology, but by obsolete wooden and canvas biplanes flying at 220 kilometers per hour, slower than many cars on the road. The ferry Swordfish, ridiculed as flying toys and antiquated gladiators, proved that sometimes the most unlikely weapon is the most effective. Their slowness, which seemed a fatal weakness, became their greatest strength. The German aiming systems were simply not designed for targets flying so slowly and so low. Lieutenant John Moffat, whose torpedo jammed the Bismarck's rudder, lived to be 97. He always insisted it was luck, not skill. "I just flew straight and dropped the torpedo. Anyone could have done that." But military historians disagree. The Swordfish attack on May 26, 1941, was one of the bravest air missions of World War II. 15 obsolete planes, in a storm, against the most powerful warship in the world. And they won. The ferry Swordfish continued in service throughout the war, sinking more tonnage of enemy ships than any other Allied aircraft type. In 1989, the last airworthy Swordfish were retired from active service, 50 years after their introduction. The Bismarck wreck was found in 1989 by explorer Robert Ballard at a depth of 4,700 meters in the North Atlantic. Analysis of the wreckage confirmed that the torpedo that jammed the rudder was the fatal blow. Without it, the Bismarck would have escaped. Sometimes, David really does defeat Goliath. And sometimes, a flying toy changes the course of history.